Let's talk about the framework trade deal that was reached between the U.S. and the EU yesterday. Emmanuel Macron has said that the deal is a dark day for Europe.
I don't know if the exact numbers will be the same that Canada will get, insofar as we are witnessing in Europe a deal that is not good for Europe.
The trade deal dynamics, Trump's strategy, and Canada's response. In a move that has raised eyebrows across the globe, President Donald Trump recently signed a major trade agreement with the European Union, EU. The deal, while brimming with dramatic gestures, including a flashy handshake in Scotland and promises of billions in energy purchases, has left Canada notably absent from the conversation. Unlike Europe, where Trump secured visible commitments, Canada, the United States' largest trading partner, found itself sidelined in the negotiations. And that omission? It wasn't accidental. For Trump, trade negotiations are more about leverage, optics, and the art of the deal than they are about economics alone. The Trump administration has consistently emphasized the transactional nature of trade deals, where success is often measured by tangible and immediate results: more purchases, more tariffs, and above all, more headlines. The EU offered Trump the kind of political payoff he craves: a major global headline and substantial buying commitments. On the other hand, Canada's role in U.S. trade has long been more embedded in the system. From oil and electricity to lumber and auto parts, Canada is crucial to U.S. supply chains. But these connections are already established. This makes Canada's trade relationships more complex, less flashy, and ultimately harder to market. In many ways, the lack of a deal with Canada comes down to the fact that it doesn't provide the kind of immediate, eye-catching leverage that Trump desires. The U.S. already buys millions of barrels of oil daily from Canada and benefits from its critical manufacturing inputs. Yet, these transactions are so deeply integrated into U.S. industry that there is little room for dramatic change, no new purchases or short-term political gains to be made. Trump's approach has always been to secure deals that are easy to sell to the public, simple transactions where the rules are clear and the benefits are immediate. Canada's relationship, however, is nuanced and far more intricate, making it difficult for Trump to package a deal that would play well politically. The result? Canada has been left out in favor of deals that deliver immediate results, even at the cost of overlooking long-term partnerships. Prime Minister Mark Carney, however, isn't rushing to strike a deal that could undermine Canada's long-term economic health. In recent statements, Carney emphasized that Canada will not sign an agreement simply to avoid short-term tariffs. Instead, the focus remains on crafting a deal that works for the country in the long term. Unlike the EU, which needs to buy U.S. energy, Canada is an exporter of energy, making its position distinctly different. This strategic divergence has kept Carney's government from rushing into a hasty agreement, opting instead for a more deliberate approach. Although Canada's trade sectors, such as auto, steel, and aluminum, have taken significant hits from tariffs, the broader economy has shown resilience. The Canadian economy grew only slightly slower than expected in the first few months of 2025, and over 90% of the cross-border trade continues to move with minimal tariffs under the new USMCA agreement. But Canada's position remains fragile. If the U.S. imposes an additional 35% tariff on Canadian goods, the true test of Canada's strategy will unfold. The fact remains, Canada's response to these challenges is strategic. It's not about yielding to pressure, but about playing a longer game. Canada's negotiators understand that a rushed deal with the U.S. may provide short-term relief, but it's not worth sacrificing the country's long-term economic structure. This measured, calculated approach may be precisely what sets Canada apart in these turbulent trade negotiations. The strategic edge, Canada's calculated patience. The absence of a swift trade deal with the U.S. has led to a surprising shift in Canada's strategy. The nation's negotiators, including Prime Minister Mark Carney, have adopted a cautious approach, emphasizing that they will only agree to terms that are genuinely beneficial for Canada's long-term economic interests. This is a stance that contrasts sharply with the Trump administration's more immediate and transactional approach to international trade. By managing expectations and carefully balancing public messaging, Carney's team has effectively shielded Canada from taking blame if talks collapse. In fact, Trump's own words may have given Canada an unexpected advantage. By openly admitting that a deal with Canada might not materialize, Trump not only weakened his negotiating position, but also handed Canada the moral high ground. The president's remarks provided Ottawa with a crucial communications victory. If talks break down, it won't be Canada's fault, but rather Washington's decision to walk away first. In a world where trade deals often depend on appearances and optics, this rare moment of clarity allowed Canada to maintain control over its narrative. Canada's strategy has been to avoid getting trapped in a quick fix, especially when the terms of a deal could harm its economic structure in the long run. As much as Trump has tried to push Canada into making a deal that benefits the U.S., Canadian officials have resisted, setting a steady course toward ensuring the nation's interests are protected. This stance could serve them well in the future, particularly in light of the mandatory review of the USMCA scheduled for 2026. Unlike the EU, Canada does not need to rely on purchasing energy from the U.S. Instead, it is a major exporter of energy, making its trade interests inherently more complex and resistant to easy solutions. The Trump administration's tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber have been painful, but Canada has been able to adjust, relying on its resilience and its continued deep ties to U.S. supply chains. The average tariff on goods crossing the U.S.-Canada border under the USMCA is relatively low, at just 2.3%. This has allowed Canada to weather the immediate storm of tariffs while preserving room for long-term strategy. Despite these advantages, Canada remains under pressure. If Trump follows through on his threats to impose a blanket 35% tariff on all non-compliant goods starting in August 2025, the stakes will rise dramatically. This situation will undoubtedly test Canada's ability to maintain its composure and strategic patience. For now, however, the government is focused on safeguarding its national interests, keeping its options open, and preparing for a future where the U.S. may no longer be the central economic player. As the 2026 review of the USMCA approaches, Canada's cautious approach may be its greatest asset. The U.S. may not prioritize Canada in the immediate term, but that doesn't mean Canada is without leverage. Canada's strategy is to wait out the immediate pressure and position itself for a stronger stance in future negotiations. Trump's impatience with Canada, while frustrating for Ottawa, may ultimately work in the latter's favor. The longer Canada resists being drawn into a hasty deal, the more leverage it gains as Trump faces the prospect of a fractured trade strategy. The question remains, will Canada hold firm, or will it cave to U.S. pressure for the sake of a quick deal? The pivot to China, Canada's strategic recalibration. In the face of continuing trade pressures from the U.S., a new possibility is emerging in Canada's economic strategy, one that could fundamentally alter its relationship with North America and the global trade landscape. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford recently voiced what many had suspected for some time. Canada might begin to shift its focus eastward to China. This wasn't just a rhetorical statement. It was a signal of a potential pivot that could have long-term strategic consequences. As U.S. tariffs continue to disrupt Canada's trade with its southern neighbor, the idea of deepening ties with China is gaining traction. The logic behind this shift is clear. With U.S. trade policy in disarray, particularly under Trump's administration, Canada has no choice but to explore other avenues for economic growth and stability. In recent months, Canadian businesses have begun to diversify their supply chains, seeking alternative markets to mitigate the risks associated with U.S. tariffs. And while China presents its own set of challenges, its market is one that can no longer be ignored. Ontario alone conducts over $43 billion in two-way trade with China, and that number is poised to grow if Canada continues to feel the economic squeeze from the U.S. China has long sought to increase its economic and strategic influence in the Western Hemisphere, and Canada's potential shift in trade priorities could play into Beijing's ambitions. If Canadian businesses begin to look eastward for their imports and exports, the impact on U.S. manufacturers could be significant. In 2024, Canada purchased $349 billion worth of goods from the U.S., more than Japan, Germany, and the U.K. combined. A shift, even a partial one, toward China would mean the U.S. could lose a substantial portion of that trade. For the U.S., this is more than just a loss in economic terms. It is a strategic blow. Washington has long sought to prevent China from expanding its influence in the Western Hemisphere, but Trump's tariffs are inadvertently pushing Canada into Beijing's arms. If Canada truly pivots to China, it could open the door for China to gain a foothold in North American trade that it has long coveted. The U.S., already facing challenges in managing its relationship with China, may find itself caught between its desire for trade dominance and its inability to retain one of its closest allies. Canada's government, however, is not rushing into this new relationship with China. Ottawa is moving cautiously, recognizing the complexities and risks of deepening trade with Beijing. While there is certainly potential for greater economic engagement, Canada must also balance this with the reality of maintaining its security and political relationships with the U.S. This delicate balancing act will shape Canada's approach to China in the years ahead. Moreover, Canada's decision to explore alternative trade routes isn't just about China. It's also about reinforcing the need for diversification. Canadian companies are already adapting by sourcing aluminum cans from China due to the rising prices of U.S. aluminum caused by Trump's tariffs. The shift is already underway, and Canadian businesses are actively seeking ways to circumvent U.S. uncertainty. RBC reports that nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are now fully compliant with the USMCA agreement, a move that reflects Canada's attempts to maintain stable trade despite the volatility of U.S. policies. In a way, the tariffs imposed by Trump have catalyzed this shift in Canadian trade strategy. What was once an implicit understanding of the U.S.-Canada trade partnership is now an uncertain and fragile reality. As Canada diversifies its economic relationships and reduces its reliance on the U.S., the impact on the U.S. will become increasingly apparent, particularly in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which rely heavily on trade with Canada. The loss of Canadian trade, whether to China or other emerging markets, will not only harm U.S. manufacturers, but also exacerbate the political fallout for Trump's administration. What started as an attempt by the U.S. to leverage its tariffs as a way to bring Canada to the negotiating table may have backfired. The tariffs intended to protect American industries have instead prompted Canada to seek alternatives, diverting trade away from the U.S. and exploring new strategic partnerships. The irony is that the very policies Trump implemented to strengthen the U.S. may have inadvertently pushed one of its closest allies into the arms of its greatest rival. In the end, Trump's trade policies are creating a new reality in North America, one where Canada is no longer beholden to the U.S. The pivot to China, though not without its risks, signals a fundamental shift in the economic landscape. Canada, no longer constrained by the whims of U.S. tariffs, is seeking new opportunities, and in doing so may reshape its role in global trade for years to come. As Canada navigates this turbulent trade environment, the question remains: will the U.S. be able to reclaim its status as Canada's primary trade partner, or will China fill the void left by Trump's tariffs?